$8.28 trillion. That is the number you will find on every infographic, every listicle, every viral post about the Dutch East India Company. Bigger than Apple, Google, and Amazon combined. The most valuable corporation in human history. And it is completely, provably wrong. The real number, according to Lodewijk Petrum, the economist who literally wrote the book on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, is closer to 1 billion. Not trillion. Billion. Petrum ran the company's peak market capitalization of 78 million guilders through the International Institute for Social History's purchasing power calculator, and arrived at roughly 1 billion modern dollars. The 8 trillion figure was popularized by infographic sites that each cited the last. None of them consulted his data. At $8 trillion, each guilder would need to equal roughly 100,000 modern dollars. A skilled worker in Golden Age Holland earned about a guilder a day. The entire global economy in 1700 was about $640 billion. A single company worth 8 trillion would have been worth more than the entire world's annual output. An obvious impossibility. The number was always absurd. It just sounded impressive enough that nobody questioned it. But here is what makes this story genuinely extraordinary. Forget the fake number. What this company actually built is worth more than any valuation could capture. The Dutch East India Company did not just trade spices. It invented the stock market. It created the first initial public offering, the first short sale, the first derivatives, the first securities regulation, and the first corporate collapse that required a government bailout. Every share you buy, every option you trade, every index fund in your retirement account runs on infrastructure that was improvised in Amsterdam 400 years ago by spice merchants, housemaids, and con artists. This is the real story. And it starts with a problem. The spices were worth a fortune, and the voyages to get them were killing nearly everyone who tried. In 1595, a Dutch merchant fleet under Cornelis de Houtman set sail for the East Indies. It was the first Dutch attempt to reach the Spice Islands directly, bypassing the Portuguese who had controlled the trade for a century. De Houtman had learned the route the hard way. He and his brother had been sent to Lisbon years earlier to steal Portuguese navigational charts and were imprisoned for espionage. The voyage itself was a complete catastrophe. Of the 249 men who departed, only 87 came home. But the survivors brought back enough pepper and spices to turn a small profit. That profit proved the route was viable, and it triggered a frenzy. Within 5 years, nearly a dozen competing Dutch companies had sent 14 fleets to Asia, undercutting each other so aggressively that profit margins were collapsing. In 1602, a statesman named Johan van Oldenbarnevelt brokered a forced merger. All of them would be consolidated into a single entity with a 21-year monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. And it would receive something no company had ever been granted: sovereign powers. The right to wage war, negotiate treaties, build forts, mint coins, and execute criminals. This was not a business. This was a state disguised as a corporation. They called it the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, VOC, and the way they funded it would change the world forever. In August of 1602, at the private house of co-founder Dirk van Oos near Dam Square in Amsterdam, a bookkeeper sat behind a vellum-covered ledger. This was the subscription book, and the rules were unlike anything in history. There was no minimum investment. Article 10 of the Charter stated, "All the residents of these lands may buy shares in this company, not just merchants, not just nobility, anyone." Previous ventures to Asia worked on a single voyage model. Rich men pooled money, funded one expedition, split the profits when ships returned, and dissolved the whole operation. The VOC was permanent, and it was open to every citizen of the Dutch Republic. 1,143 people signed that ledger in Amsterdam alone. Bakers, blacksmiths, brewers, carpenters, 7 housemaids. A woman named Niltgen Cornelis, a maid working in the Van O's household itself, invested 100 guilders. Her daily wage was roughly half a guilder. She was committing 200 days of her labor to a venture that planned to sail to the opposite side of the planet and might never return. At the other end of the ledger, a merchant named Isaac Lemaire committed 85,000 guilders, the single largest subscription. Across all 6 chambers in the Dutch Republic, the total reached 6.4 million guilders. That was 10 times the entire capitalization of the English East India Company. The gamble paid off almost immediately. In February of 1603, VOC ships captured a Portuguese merchant vessel called the Santa Catarina. When the cargo was auctioned in Amsterdam, it sold for about 3.5 million guilders. A single seized ship yielded more than half of the company's entire starting capital. To understand why, you need to understand what spices meant in the 17th century. Pepper was not a condiment. It was a preservative in a world without refrigeration, a medicine, and a marker of social status. Europe consumed 80% of the world's total pepper harvest. Cloves, grown almost exclusively in the Maluku Islands, fetched 10 times their purchase price by the time they reached the port of Malacca, and 10 times again by the time they arrived in Amsterdam. But nutmeg was the real prize. It grew naturally nowhere on Earth except 6 tiny volcanic islands called the Banda Islands, 500 miles east of Java. Europeans believed it could cure the plague, treat fevers, and ward off infection. Because no other source existed anywhere on the planet, the markup from purchase price in Banda to retail in Europe exceeded 60,000%. A single cargo of nutmeg could make a merchant wealthy for the rest of his life. That is not a figure of speech. That is what the ledgers show. These were the economics that funded everything that followed, and the investors had been promised their money back after 10 years. The charter guaranteed it. That promise was broken, and from that broken promise, the modern financial system was born. When 1612 arrived, the company could not afford to return the capital. The directors had no intention of surrendering their enterprise. The States General intervened on their behalf, overruled the shareholders, and locked the capital in permanently. If you wanted out, you had one option: find someone else willing to buy your position. So they did. Investors began trading their stakes informally, first on the Nieuwe Brug, the new bridge over the Damrock Canal, where merchants already gathered to deal in commodities, then inside the abandoned St. Olaf's Chapel nearby. By 1611, Amsterdam had opened a purpose-built exchange designed by architect Hendrik de Keyser, with fixed hours, weekdays only, 11 in the morning to noon. After hours, deals continued in the inns on Kalverstraat. This was the world's first stock exchange. It was not designed, it was a workaround. Shareholders trapped in a company they could not exit invented a secondary market out of pure necessity. Every stock exchange on Earth descends from that solution. The viral infographics claim VOC shares peaked during the 1637 tulip mania. They did not. In 1637, shares traded at about 270 on an index where par was 100. The actual peak, roughly 1200, arrived in 1720, during the speculative frenzy that followed England's South Sea bubble. The real mania came 80 years later, built on the financial instruments Amsterdam had spent a century inventing. But once you can trade shares, you can do something far more dangerous. You can bet against them. Isaac Lemaire, the largest original investor, had been expelled from the board of directors in 1605 amid embezzlement allegations. He was furious, and on February 11, 1609, he organized history's first short sale. Lemaire gathered 8 merchants into a secret syndicate called the Groot Compagnie. Their scheme was elegant and ruthless. They sold VOC shares for future delivery through forward contracts, shares they did not actually own. Then they deployed accomplices to spread false rumors across Amsterdam's trading floors, stories of mismanagement, piracy, and sinking ships. The share price fell. When the contracts came due, Lemaire's group would buy shares at the depressed price and pocket the difference. But Lemaire's real goal was more ambitious than profit. He wanted to crash the price below par value, triggering demands for the long overdue 1612 liquidation. Dissolve the company entirely, and he could launch rival ventures without the monopoly standing in his way. The directors fought back fiercely. They petitioned the government, claiming these vile practices harmed many widows and orphans who held shares. In February of 1610, the States of Holland banned blank sales, the sale of shares the seller did not possess. The first securities regulation in recorded history. Lemaire's syndicate settled at a loss. Several members went bankrupt. But the ban was renewed repeatedly over following decades because it was routinely ignored. The world's first financial regulation produced the world's first regulatory arbitrage. From Lemaire's innovation, a complete derivatives ecosystem evolved. By the 1680s, Amsterdam traders dealt in options on VOC shares. Monthly settlement days let traders cancel out gains and losses without ever exchanging a single physical share. A single share cost roughly 17,000 guilders by 1688, so fractional instruments were created to let smaller investors speculate. The Amsterdam Wisselbank, founded in 1609, provided the settlement infrastructure for all of it. Adam Smith discussed the institution at length in The Wealth of Nations. But the Wisselbank had a fatal secret. It had been making massive unsecured loans to VOC in violation of its own charter. When the company defaulted, it dragged the bank down with it. In 1688, a Portuguese Sephardic banker named Joseph de la Vega published Confusion of Confusions, the world's first book about stock trading. The Financial Times would name it one of the 10 best investment books ever written. De la Vega noted that cumulative VOC dividends had reached 1,482% of the original capital. His advice has never been improved upon. Whoever wishes to become rich must have both money and patience. If you are finding value in this kind of forensic analysis of how the world's most powerful systems actually work, consider subscribing. It helps more than you might expect. While Amsterdam was building the architecture of modern finance, the source of all that wealth was being secured by force. In 1621, Governor-General John Pieterszoon Cohen made the calculation that would define the legacy of the VOC. The Bandanese had traded freely with multiple partners for centuries. They had no concept of exclusive contracts and no interest in honoring monopoly agreements they had been pressured into signing. So Cohen's forces invaded. Approximately 2,800 Bandanese were killed, many from deliberate starvation. 1,700 more were enslaved. A population of roughly 15,000 was reduced to less than 1,000. The VOC divided the islands into 70 plantations, imported slave labor from Java, soaked every exported seed in lime to prevent unauthorized cultivation, and burned surplus harvests to maintain artificial scarcity pricing. The monopoly held for 150 years. It broke only in the 1770s, when French missionaries smuggled seedlings to Mauritius. For cloves, the company conducted annual armed fleet inspections called hongi raids to find and destroy unauthorized clove trees. Since clove trees take over a decade to mature, a single raid could permanently eliminate a community's livelihood. In 1667, the Treaty of Breda produced one of history's most revealing exchanges. England gave the VOC the tiny island of Run, a Banda nutmeg source. In return, the Dutch surrendered a swampy island on the coast of North America. The English renamed it New York. Manhattan for nutmeg. At the time, the Dutch considered it a bargain. At its 1669 peak, the company operated 150 merchant ships and 40 warships, employed 50,000 people, and maintained a private army of 10,000 soldiers. Over its entire history, it dispatched 4,785 ships and sent nearly 1 million Europeans to Asia. Only about 340,000 came back, a 66% non-return rate. The company consumed roughly 4,000 human lives per year for almost 2 centuries. Cohen himself stated the operating logic without apology. "We cannot carry on trade without war, nor war without trade." And yet, with all that power, the company was already dying from within. The VOC never published a single financial statement in 197 years. Shareholders guessed company health from dividends alone. In 1622, dissenting shareholders holding 40% of shares accused the directors of self-enrichment and claimed the account books had been smeared with bacon so that they might be eaten by dogs. Nothing changed. By the 1670s, growth had stalled. Japan restricted silver exports, cutting off the metal that financed intra-Asian trade. Taiwan had been lost to the warlord Koxinga in 1662, ending the lucrative silk trade with China. High-margin spices gradually gave way to tea, coffee, and textiles, commodities that dozens of competitors could also supply. Margins halved from 18% to 10%. Return on invested capital fell from 6% to barely 3%. But the directors would not cut dividends. Cutting dividends would crash the share price and expose how fragile the company had become. So they funded payouts through anticipatory loans, borrowing against the expected revenues of ships still at sea. They were paying shareholders with money the company had not yet earned. When capital ran short, directors slashed salaries and then officially legalized private trading by employees. One official wrote that it is taken for granted that officials receive salaries insufficient to live on, and it is therefore absolutely necessary not to supervise their financial dealings too closely. Governor General Joan Van Horn earned 14,000 guilders a year. He left office with 10 million guilders, 700 times his total compensation. The company's final anti-corruption measure was not to stop the corruption, it was to tax it. By the 1760s, military costs hit 12 million guilders annually, while profits sat at 6 million guilders. Beneath everything was the structural flaw that made recovery impossible. The capital base remained frozen at 6.4 million guilders from 1602 to 1799. The company never issued additional shares. Every fleet, every fortress, every expansion was financed entirely with debt. The ratio climbed from 2-to-1 to 4-to-1 by the 1760s. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, which began in 1780, was the killing blow. Britain blockaded the Dutch coast, seized key colonial positions in Ceylon and Sumatra, and destroyed roughly half the remaining fleet. The debt-to-equity ratio exploded to 18-to-1. The last dividend was paid in 1782. When the French army invaded the Netherlands in January of 1795, the game was over. The VOC board was dismissed in 1796. The charter expired December 31, 1799. Total debt at dissolution reached somewhere between 134 million and 219 million guilders, all absorbed by the state. Shareholders received nothing. The company that invented the stock market became the first too-big-to-fail bailout in history. The structural logic maps perfectly onto every major corporate collapse that followed. Permanent capital locked shareholders into an entity they could not control. Separation of ownership from management gave directors unchecked power across an 8-month communication gap. Limited liability removed consequences. When Enron hid debt in off-balance sheet vehicles, that was the VOC borrowing against homebound cargo. When Lehman Brothers maintained dividends while leverage spiraled, that was the Heeren Sevington paying out money that did not exist. When regulators concluded an institution was too interconnected to let fail, that was the Dutch government absorbing 200 million guilders rather than let the system break. Every time you open a brokerage app and buy a share of stock, you are using a system invented by people who were locked out of their own investment and had to improvise an exit. Every derivative traces its lineage to a bitter merchant who wanted to burn down the company that expelled him. Every financial crisis follows the same arc: innovate, extract, obscure the books, pay dividends with debt, and pray the war does not come. The VOC wrote the playbook. We are still running it. The next episode on this channel examines a system you interact with every single day. One designed so carefully that you never think to ask who controls it. You will find it on the channel page.